If you remember a couple of months ago, I think it was a couple of months ago, I covered the Z540, which also had an insane speeds for Gen 5 in general, and it was solid. I would say it was solid, but as per usual we have with Gen 5, you do have to have a really good passive cooling or active cooling even, which is much better, of course, to prevent from thermal throttling in general, because you can't use an SSD like this without any passive heatsink on. So today we have something really interesting. I do have to admit, this is TEAMGROUP's T-FORCE GC Pro Gen 5x4, 2 terabytes this time, because this model comes in 2 and 4 terabytes version, so there's no 1 or 512, and to be honest, it really doesn't make sense. This makes sense, 2 and 4, right? So what I'm going to do today is, of course, you're going to see loads of benchmarks in general, but this is quite interesting. First of all, because it comes, as well as the Z540, of course, comes with a graphene sticker, which is also a passive heatsink that helps with the heat dissipation. It's more effective in terms with Gen 5, Gen 4, because it doesn't heat up that much compared to the Gen 5 that actually does. So I use it on ASRock X870 Steel Legend Wi-Fi, paired it up with AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D, and the performance was quite solid, I do have to admit. I think this is definitely one of the best performing SSD on the channel currently that I had, and in terms of read and write speeds, IOPS, I don't even have to go there. It's just insane. When you see the benchmarks, you'll realize everything. But before we go, of course, we have to go into details and check something out, because this SSD has quite interesting parts as well. So in those terms, what we have is what they stated: maximum read speeds go up to 12,500 megabytes per second, write speeds up to 11,000 megabytes per second, storage temperature from -40 to +85, and operating temperature from 0 to 70 degrees. Endurance is 1200 TBW, and for 4 terabytes, I think, if I remember correctly, 2400 TBW. Mean time before failure is 1.6 million hours. And when we're talking about components inside, we have 3D TLC YMTC 232 layer NAND. The controller is quite actually regular in those terms, a new one, InnoGrid IG5666 FAA, which in some terms, I'll get to that part later on. Let me just finish this, right? So we have DRAM, we get 2 gigabytes of SK Hynix DDR4 at 2666, and the interesting part is the price tag for this one is around $170. Now, if you add that air cooler, well, passive plus air cooler, Dark AirFlow 1, which is $26 or 30, let's circulate around for 30, that's $200, right, for 2 terabyte Gen 5x4. When you compare it to other competitors, it's still $30-ish cheaper than the competition, which is good, I do have to admit. Now, in this scenario, I didn't benchmark it with that Dark AirFlow 1, because I wanted to check it out specifically with the passive heatsink on the Steel Legend. Why? Well, first of all, it has a bit thicker first passive heatsink for the M.2 SSDs, and that could be quite interesting in terms of that. Now, in some other details, it's a two-sided SSD. That's important because, and I do have to mention this, some M.2 slots have either too thick thermal pad or something else, and since we have those quick releases when we're talking about the heatsinks, sometimes you really have to push hard in those terms that you think you're gonna break the SSD. Luckily you won't, but still it's not a pleasant feeling. And basically mentioning all the serial numbers of the chips, it doesn't make sense to go into those details. So on one side we have the graphene sticker, and on the other we have this, well, basically more information that's just serial numbers and stuff like that. So let's jump into benchmarks, because this is what is interesting, right? As per usual, we're starting with ASSD. Read speeds go up to 12,130.14 megabytes per second, and write speeds go up to 11,117.24 megabytes per second. Now, the thermals on this one, with this benchmark, was 61 degrees. And as you know, ASSD always shows a bit less than what manufacturer states in all scenarios, literally in all scenarios. I never had a situation where I tested an SSD with ASSD that it actually shown the exact same speeds as they did on the box or on their website. So that is something, just so it's not specifically on this one or any other that I tested. Then we go with that to this benchmark. So In this benchmark, as you already know, I can see the consistency because it has some number of runs that go and read so they can pick up the scores and stuff like that, right? So read speeds, the maximum was 12.53 gigabytes per second. Write speeds was 11.35 gigabytes per second. Now, at this point, what I witness is at somewhere in the middle, it reached 12.53. And then in the last 5 runs, because it reached 71 degrees, with the passive heatsink and with the graphene sticker, it actually went down to 11.5 gigabytes per second. So that's a bit of a downside. It didn't thermal throttle because there wasn't any, ups and downs with the speeds. It just went down to 11.5 in the last 5 runs. That's it. But the consistency in those first, I think it's 10 or something like that, was there. Now we go with Crystal Disk benchmark, and what we got here is read speeds 12,977.48 megabytes per second and write speeds 11,945.66 megabytes per second. And this is what I stated, that this is definitely the best performing SSD in general, because let's just skip Gen 4 and Gen 3, Gen 5 on the channel. But the thermals went up to 75 degrees. And IOPS read 2,046,000, IOPS write 1.6 million. So yeah, in Crystal Diskmark it really did perform, and in those terms it didn't. In Crystal Diskmark it didn't have any drops in those terms, but you can't see in Crystal Diskmark is it going upwards or downwards. It just shows the end result. Now in 54.9 gigabyte file transfer speed, read speeds were 4.03 gigabytes per second, while the write speed 3.63 gigabytes per second, which is kind of usual. I don't get any different score, maybe just a bit different, like 0.1 gigabyte per second difference, which is quite alright. And then we go with 3D Mark storage benchmark. It scored 3357. And when you take everything else into consideration, you can see that it does look quite nice and solid. These averages and in general the transfer speeds are quite nice. It does look a bit strange when you're seeing gigabytes up there with the transfer speed, and then you see here megabytes. It's a bit different story when we're talking about that. So as I stated, GC Pro is actually quite good in those terms. You do need a dedicated cooler for this one, without a doubt. Maybe the motherboard heatsink won't be good enough. Maybe you should definitely go with Dark Airflow 1, because as you know, as I tested it on Z540, it actually did perform quite good and it didn't thermal throttle after that. So Gen 5 in general needs a passive heatsink, because this graphene one doesn't do the work. It helps with the heat dissipation, but not in terms of keeping it stable. So always go, if you're going with Gen 5 SSD, go with a dedicated cooler if your motherboard for some strange reason doesn't have it, or it's either too thin. So yeah, that's the only thing that I could do. Since this is definitely the best performing SSD on the channel, this is going with PC Crazy Performance badge, and just with proper cooling you'll get the consistency and you won't get thermal throttling. It didn't get thermal throttling, just to clarify that. It didn't go, because thermal throttling, what usually I encountered, it spikes up with the thermals, drops with the speeds. And then when it cools down, it spikes up with the speeds again until it heats up again. And then, you have ups and downs, and that is nowhere with consistency. This GC Pro didn't do that, and that's why I'm giving it the PC Crazy Performance badge. So all in all, it's cheaper than the competition, $30-ish, specifically if you add the Dark Airflow 1, and you'll be satisfied with that combination. So yeah, TEAMGROUP T-FORCE GC Pro 2 terabyte, and you have it in 4 version as well. I'll try to place both in the description below, so you could basically check out the prices that are current. This is what I noticed today. So yeah, that's the only reason you have those links, and eventually if you want to buy them, of course, not saying anything that you need to. And that'll be all for today, guys. Thank you for watching, and see you tomorrow in another one. Bye bye.